Hi, it's Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and we have a new pattern today. It's a Halloween pattern of a very fancy, very elegant witch, and I did a couple of fun things to show her in a Polaroid frame as if we've taken a picture of her at a Halloween party, and her hat is popping out of the top of that frame. So I'm going to take you through all of the how-to on how to make her, but I just want to give you a quick overview here for those of you who are brand new to the Quilt As You Go method that I use. So I've got a video, I've got a free workshop actually that takes you through all of these steps in great detail. So here it is in a nutshell, and in order to explain it, I'm actually going to flip her over and show it to you from the back. So I begin by quilting the background square to the batting only. So all of this work that we're going to be doing is just on the batting of the fabric. There's no backing yet, but this is when we do all of the wiggly spinning things around and you don't want to have a huge quilt that you're working with. This is when I do all of that quilting of the block. So I quilt the block first, then I add the applique and outline the applique, and then when I'm done, all of the fancy work done on the block, that's when I trim them to size, sew them together, press the seams open, and then I add a quilt back and I do just quilting along the seam lines, just stitch in the ditch along the seam lines that are joining the blocks together, so that when I have the huge mass of the quilt in front of me that I'm trying to wrestle under the machine, all I need to do are straight line quilting in pretty far apart. If I was doing a quilt that didn't have the Polaroid blocks, they would be just 10 inches apart. And a quilt that's made all of 10-inch squares, I can do a nap size quilt. It's a great size for the couch. I can quilt all of that final round of quilting in a half an hour. So for 30 minutes, I'm okay with wrestling the whole mass of the quilt underneath as long as it's all straight lines. But I like to do an individual block and get curves and fun shapes in my quilting background. You can't see it so much in her, but you can see it in a lot of my other blocks. So the pattern is available at shinyhappyworld.com, and I'm going to show you now how to make her. Okay, so the witch pattern is available in two different sizes in the pattern. So almost all of my quilt patterns are designed to fit in a 10-inch square, and the witch will do that, but she's got a tall pointy hat, and so to get her hat to fit in that square, she's actually fairly small in the block. But I went ahead and I have that as an option so that if you're making one of my quilts and you want it to be that standardized size, you can print out the page of the pattern that is set for a 10-inch block, and it tells you that right on the page. But what I'm going to do with this one is I'm making my witch a little bit bigger, and her hat, I'm going to do a Polaroid frame around this block, and her hat is actually going to come up out of the top of the background, and it's going to overlap the top edge of the Polaroid frame so that it looks like her hat is kind of popping out of the photograph. So for that, I've got another totally formatted pattern designed to fit in a 12-inch block. So that'll fit completely enclosed in a 12-inch block, or you can use it in a 10-inch block and let it explode out the top. So that's what I'm doing. So you're going to see two different options for pattern pages in the pattern. One, the pieces are a little smaller to fit in a 10-inch block, and slightly larger pieces to fit in a 12-inch block. So choose the size that you're going to use, or use the SVG file if you're using an electric cutting machine like a Cricut or a Silhouette, and then you can adjust that to any size that you want. But I have printed out here the size for the 12-inch block. So you can either print it directly onto the Heat and Bond Light, that's the fusible adhesive that I like to use. Heat and Bond is the brand, Light is the weight of the adhesive. It's the one in the purple package. You can print it directly onto the paper side of that, or you can print it onto just regular printer paper and you can trace it onto your fusible adhesive. So that's the first step. Then you're going to roughly cut all of the shapes out. And when I say roughly cut, I mean you're going to cut with a little bit of white space around all of those solid lines. So you cut each piece out roughly, with that little bit of extra, and then you're going to fuse them to the back side of your fabric. So get all of the pieces cut out roughly and get all of them fused to the back side of the fabric, and then we will move on to the next step of the project. Okay, next step what we're going to do is what I call clean cutting the pieces, and that means cutting on the solid lines, cutting each of the shapes out. Now the reason that you do the rough cut first and then fuse and then do the clean cut is so that you get the adhesive all the way to the cut edges of your fabric. So right now I'm cutting through pieces that are fused with adhesive. So now when I cut this off and I'm left with this nice clean edge, I know that the fusible adhesive covers every last thread of this cut piece. So I've got all of the pieces for the witch cut out now. So we've got her face, her neck, we've got a hat band, the hat brim, her collar, the patch on her hat. She's got a couple of itty bitty eyes, and if you don't want to do pieces that small, you can use fabric paint, you can use hand embroidery, you can use markers. I've got a whole post that shows all different kinds of options for the eyes if you don't want to do those as applique. And we've got a hat piece. So all of this, just to be clear, you're cutting on the solid lines. All of these dotted lines that you see on the pattern are just for placement, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so all of your pieces are fused, they're cut, and you've cut them out on the solid lines. Now we're going to take care of all of these dotted lines. Those are all placement lines, so they show you where the patch goes, where her neck overlaps her collar, all of those pieces in there. The most important, if you don't want to mark all of these pieces, but you only want to mark the most important ones, the most important ones are the ones that I mark with a black Sharpie. That is the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So it's really important to get the eyes in the right place. So I always mark them, and I just use a black Sharpie because I'm just going to put black applique on it. So I'm not worried about my lines showing through. They're not going to show through the black fabric. And I'm going to stitch exactly on the nose and the mouth with black thread. So again, the black line, even though it's a permanent line, is totally fine to use. For all of the rest of the markings, I use something erasable. If the fabric is dark enough for a white chalk line to show, that's what I use. So this is my preferred marker, and you can see this on the back of her. Let me make sure I'm getting her close enough. So you can see I've marked the eyes, the nose, and the mouth with my Sharpie, and then I marked all the other lines just with a chalk line. I hope it's showing up on camera. It's very clear to me, but if there is a fabric that the white is just not showing up on, then I just use a regular pencil. You can actually erase pencil off of fabric just using an eraser. I like these Ticonderoga pencils, but I don't use the black eraser when I'm erasing off of fabric because it can leave a little bit of a smudge. So I do have one special tool, and that is just a very, very inexpensive white artist's eraser. So on all of these, you can see that I have now transferred all of those dotted lines. And on all of these colors, the chalk line worked. So next up, we're going to assemble all the pieces, and you'll see all of those placement lines in action. Okay, now we're ready to start layering in the pieces, and you're going to see all those placement markings in action. And just as a reminder, this one is not actually going to fit in this block. We want the tip of that hat to come out over the top of the block. So we're going to start with the collar piece. Peel off the paper backing and just put it somewhere in the bottom of your block, roughly centered. And you want to have the cut edge at the bottom of her collar lined up with the raw edge at the bottom of your block here. And then we're going to put in her neck, her very elegant, slender neck. And I've got the lines on the collar showing me exactly where that goes. Next up, we're going to lay in her face. And there are two markings here that are going to be helpful. The marking here on her face shows me where it overlaps the neck. And the marking here on her chin shows me how far it overlaps. So once I get that covered up, I'm good. And the markings on the rest of the collar show me the angle that her face sits at. And then we've got the brim of her hat. It's got a very swoopy brim. And again, I've got a line here, a mark here that shows me where it overlaps, and a mark on her head showing me how much it overlaps. Now we've got that swoopy brim. And then we have the crown of her hat. And this one, the lines can be a little bit weird because we've got the crown of the hat and the band that kind of overlap. But we've got two things. This is showing us, this top line is showing us where it overlaps. And down here, it's this middle line that we want. So that is showing us, you can see that this line continues the top edge of the hat. So that's a good visual cue for us. And as expected, the hat just barely peeks out of the top of that. Now we've got the hat band, and this is where some of those other lines come in. So now is when we're looking at this lower line and this middle line. There we go. And this line is actually showing us the cut edge of the crown piece. And then we have the spider patch, which I did very deliberately cut so that there was a spider in that patch. A little fussy cutting fun. And then we've got the tiny little eyes, which nobody likes to do, but it only takes a minute to outline them. And there are options if you really don't want to do that stitching. And I've got a video, a special tutorial that just gives you some tips for outlining tiny pieces like that. Let me get this other one on there. And there she is. So all of the pieces are layered in. Normally I would just fuse the whole thing down, but again, we're doing the busting out of his block thing, and I've got a whole separate tutorial on that I will link to that has more detailed instructions for getting that busting out. But in a nutshell, I'm going to fuse everything down except for the tip of her hat. So I'll fuse everything from about this bend down, get all of that locked into place. Once you fuse it, it's permanent. I'll leave this floppy so I can fold it back while I sew on the Polaroid frame. Then I'll flip it back down and fuse it down. So when I come back, this will all be fused in place. It'll have the Polaroid frame, and I'll have all of the outlining done. And I'll talk you step by step through all of the path that I take to outline this. All right, here she is, all finished. And I'm going to just quickly take you through the path that I took to outline her. So I always plan out my path ahead of time to minimize the number of times I need to start and stop and tie a knot and start again. So I really think about it before I go into each block. And for her, I started here on the side of her hat, just above where the hat brim comes in. And I go around all the pieces 3 times. I just like that kind of sketchy look, but you can go around it just once if you like. But here's what I did. Start here and go around the crown of the hat once. On the second trip around, I go past the bottom of this patch and then go once, twice, 3 times, and then just double up on the side of this patch. Now I'm going to continue the third trip around the crown of the hat, and that includes the band here. Third trip all the way around the base of that orange band. I go back to where I started and I continue stitching, and now I'm going to pick up the top half of this hat band. And I go once, twice, 3 times, and then I just continue onto the crown of the hat. And I go around there once, twice, and 3 times and tie my first knot. So now the hat is completely done. Now I'm going to pick up around the face. And I start here on the side of the head, and I go down once, twice, 3 times, and then I just travel along the brim of the hat a little bit to pick up her nose. And I go down once, twice, 3 times, tie my knot, and I'm done. Now I just do the mouth. There's no help for it. You just have to do once, twice, 3 times, tie it off. And I go just once around each eye. Since it's black stitching on a black fabric, you can't see it anyway. So I just do once around each eye and tie it off. Now what we've got left is this neck and collar unit. And I started here on the side of the face and went around the collar, this side of the collar once, twice, 3 times. And then I very, very, very carefully went inside this collar, making really sure not to get any stitching onto that white fabric there, because you would see that. And then I picked up here once, twice, 3 times, traveled over on her chin. So that's 4 rows of stitching on her chin, but you can't see the difference between 4 and 3. So it's a really tricky way to travel. And then I went down here once, twice, 3 times. Again, very carefully and slowly stitched along the black collar just inside that white fabric. And then the last bit is once, twice, 3 times, tied it off, and she is all outlined, all finished. And now I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. Let me get my camera reset so that you can see the whole Polaroid block in there. And I've actually got her set kind of at an angle. Actually, I can't even get the whole thing in here. But I'll move it around a little bit so you can see. So I've got the Polaroid block is set at an angle here, and I'll trim the candy cane frame around it a little bit closer eventually. But she's sitting just like that photograph of her has been tossed onto a tabletop somewhere. So I've got it just tipped at a little bit of an angle. Not only do I like the cute effect of it being tipped at an angle, but then I don't have to measure and make sure that everything is perfectly straight. So it's a win-win in my book there. So there we go. You can see the bottom edge of the Polaroid frame and up to the top edge, and she is all finished.